everyone, today I'm going to tell you one of the most fascinating and mysterious stories in history. The mystery of the Titanic. You've probably heard about the Titanic before. Maybe you've seen the famous movie or read about it in books. But I promise, after listening to this, you will feel like you're hearing this story for the first time. I'm going to tell you everything in great detail, and some things might even surprise you, so sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of the Titanic by the end of this story. You will not only learn about the Titanic, but also improve your English skills. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a dream, a symbol of luxury, success, and human achievement. Let's go back to the early 1900s when ships were the main way to travel across oceans. At that time, two shipping companies, White Star Line and Cunard Line, were competing to build the best and most luxurious ships in the world. Card Line had two fast and famous ships, Lusitania and Morania. These ships were fast, but White Star Line wanted to do something different. They didn't just want speed. They wanted luxury comfort. And Size White Star Line decided to build three ships that would be the largest and most luxurious in the world. Olympic Titanic and pretend out of these Titanic became the most famous, but not for the reasons. The company hoped the Titanic was built in Belfast, Northern Ireland, by a shipbuilding company called Harland and Wolff. The construction started in March 1909 and took almost 3 years to complete. Thousands of workers worked day and night to build this giant ship. It was 882 269 m long and 175 feet 53 m tall. Imagine if the Titanic was almost the size of three football fields placed end to end. Now let's talk about why the Titanic was called unsinkable. The ship had 16 watertight compartments, and the engineers believed that even if 4 of these compartments filled with water, the ship would still float. This technology was so advanced at the time that people thought it was impossible for the Titanic to sink. The vice president of White Star Line, a man named Philip Franklin, was so confident that he said in front of the public, "The Titanic is unsinkable." Everyone believed it. The media wrote about it. It became the ship that could never sink. No, let's step inside the Titanic. Can see what made it all luxurious, curious. That time, traveling on the Titanic was not just a journey. It was the ship's experience. The interiors were designed to look like a five-star hotel. In fact, many people said that the Titanic was even better than the best hotels in the world. The wood paneling on the walls was carved by hand and polished to shine. The stained glass windows sparkled in the sunlight. There were two grand staircases, and one of them, the first class grand staircase, became iconic, was decorated with iron railings, gold details, and a beautiful glass dome above it. This staircase connected several decks and was where wealthy passengers would gather to show off their expensive clothes and jewelry. The Titanic had more than just beautiful rooms. It had facilities that were rare for ships at that time: a heated swim pool, Turkish bath where passengers could relax, an electric bath, which was considered a modern luxury, a gymnasium with exercise machines, a squash court for sports lovers, a library where singers could read books, two barbershops for grooming and haircuts. There were also restaurants, cafes, and smoking rooms where passengers could socialize. One of the restaurants, called the a la carte restaurant, was so fancy that you had to pay extra to eat. The first-class cabins were decorated with silk curtains, elegant furniture, and the finest bedding. These class cabins were better than the first-class cabins on many other ships. The third-class cabins, though simple, were still more comfortable than those on most ships of that time. The Titanic cost $7.5 million to build in 1912, which is about $200 million today. Tickets were also very expensive. A first-class ticket cost $4,350. Back then, like paying $100,000 today. Second-class tickets were about $1,500 today. Third-class tickets were $15 to $40, around $400 to $1,000 today. The Titanic was a luxury ship, and only the rich people could afford first-class tickets. When the Titanic was finally completed, people all over the world very excited. It was the biggest ship ever built. Famous actors, businessmen, and wealthy families booked their tickets months in advance. Everyone wanted to be part of the Titanic's maiden voyage, its first journey from Southampton, England to New York City, USA. The Titanic set sail on April 10th, 1912. Crowds of people gathered at the port in Southampton to see the ship. All families waved goodbye to their loved ones, and photographers clicked pictures of the grand ship as it slowly left the dock. On board were 2,224 passengers and crew members. Some of the wealthiest people in the world were there, including John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, Molly Brown, a famous socialite, Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store, and his wife, Ida Straus. There were also immigrants traveling in third class, hoping to start a new life in America. For them, the Titanic represented hope and opportunity. The Titanic's journey started smoothly. The ship was cruising at a speed of 21.5 knots, which is about 10 kilometers per hour. Everything seemed perfect. passengers enjoyed the luxurious facilities, relaxed in their cabins, and dinned in the elegant restaurants. The weather was calm and the sea looked peaceful, but just 2 days into the voyage, the Titanic received its first ice warning. It was a message from another ship warning about icebergs in the North Atlantic. At that time, icebergs were common in the area, especially in April, but nobody worried too much. After all, the Titanic was unsinkable. Right, the Titanic's journey continued, and by April 14th, 1912, it had been sailing for 4 days. Everything seemed perfect. Passengers were enjoying their luxurious surroundings, the sea was calm, and the weather was clear. But Noon knew that this peaceful day would turn into a disaster, that the world would never forget. Throughout April 14th, the Titanic received berg warnings from other ships in the area. These messages were sent through Morse code, a way of communicating using dots and dashes. Each warning informed the Titanic's crew about large icebergs ahead in the North Atlantic. Here's what happened with these warnings. Some of the messages never reached the Captain Edward John Smith because they were not marked as surgeons. Some were sent to the moralist operators who were busy sending messages for passengers and didn't give the warnings much attention. Even the warnings that did reach the captain were not taken seriously. Captain Smith believed the Titanic was safe. The ship was advertised as unsinkable, and many people trusted this claim. Finn thought the warning suggested danger ahead. The captain did not slow down the ship. The Titanic continued at its maximum speed of 21.5 knots, which is about 4.0 km/h. The night of April 14th was unusually dark, the moon was not visible, and the stars provided little light. This made it difficult to see anything in the distance. The sea was also unusually calm, which might sound like a good thing, but it wasn't. Normally waves would crash against icebergs, making them easier to spot, but that night the water was so smooth that the icebergs were almost invisible on the ship's deck. Two lookout men, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed in the crow's nest, a small platform high above the deck. Their job was to watch or any dangers ahead, especially icebergs. They didn't have binoculars because the officer who had them left the ship before the journey and then forgot to hand the mover. This made their job even harder. At 11:39 p.m., everything changed. Frederick Fleet, sitting in the crow's nest, saw something dark and massive directly in front of the ship. At first, he wasn't sure what it was. Then, as the Titanic got closer, he realized it was an iceberg, a huge one. Fleet immediately rang the warning bell 3 times. This was the signal for danger. He then grabbed the phone and called the bridge where officers controlled the ship. He shouted iceberg right ahead. The officers on the bridge, including First Officer William Murdoch, reacted quickly. Murdoch ordered the crew to turn the ship to the left, reverse the engines to slow the ship down, but it was too late. Just 37 seconds after the iceberg was spotted at 11:40 p.m. The Titanic crashed into it. The iceberg was enormous, 2,200 thigh and 400 feet long. According to researchers, it was about 100,000 years old and weighed around 1.5 million tons. The collision caused pieces of ice to fall onto the deck of the Titanic, but the real damage was happening below the waterline. This is one of the biggest mysteries of the Titanic. How could a piece of ice damage a ship made of solid metal? To understand this, look at a few important details. 1. The iceberg's weight and strength. Icebergs are not soft like ice cubes in your drink. They are massive and solid with sharp jets that can act like knives. The part of the iceberg above water was only a small fraction of its total size. Most of it was underwater, making it extremely heavy and powerful. 2. The Titanic steel. The Titanic was made of steel, but the steel used in 1912 was not as strong as the steel we use today. It became brittle in very cold temperatures, and the North Atlantic was freezing that night. When the iceberg hit the Titanic, the steel plates cracked instead of bending through the rye. That's the metal rivet that held the Titanic steel plates together were another problem. Some of the rivets were made of a weaker material called rotiron. When the iceberg hit, these rivets popped out, creating gaps in the ship's hull. The iceberg scraped along the Titanic side. It opened 6 narrow holes below the waterline. These holes were small, but water began pouring in at an alarming rate when the collision happened. Most passers didn't realize anything was wrong. Some people felt a slight jolt, while others heard a grinding noise as the iceberg scraped along the ship. In the first-class dining room, a few people joked, "What was that? Did we hit something in the engine room?" However, the crew knew the situation was serious. Water was rushing into the lower decks. The Titanic's watertight compartments were supposed to keep the ship safe, but the iceberg had damaged more compartments than the ship could handle. Scientists believe the iceberg that hit the Titanic started as part of a glacier in Greenland over thousands of years. It broke off and drifted into the North Atlantic. By the time it hit the Titanic, it was one of the largest icebergs in the area. Its size and weight made it unstoppable. By midnight, water had flooded the first 5 compartments of the Titanic. This was a critical problem. The ship's design could handle flooding in 4 compartments, but not 5. Captain Smith was informed of the damage and he realized the Titanic was in serious trouble. The ship, once called unsinkable, was now sinking, but most passengers were still unaware of the danger. The music in the first class lounge continued to play, and people were still talking and laughing by 12 a.m. On April 15th, 1912, just 20 minutes after the Titanic hit the iceberg, the situation became increasingly dire. Captain Edward John Smith, who had been confident in his ship's safety just hours earlier, was now faced with the unimaginable truth. The Titanic was sinking at midnight. Captain Smith called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. He gave them clear orders: start lowering the lifeboats, send distress signals to nearby ships, calm the passengers, and avoid creating panic. The Titanic was equipped with 20 lifeboats, but these were not enough for the 2,224 people on board. The lifeboats had space for only about 1,178 people, which meant more than 1,000 people would have no chance of survival. This would design flaws the ship built to carry more lifeboats, but the company decided not to include them, to keep the deck spacious and aesthetically pleasing as the crew began lowering lifeboats. The Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, started sending distress signals using Morse code. They used the call sign CQ, which meant come quiet distress. Later, they also used SOS, the new international distress signal that was easier to recognize. One of these distress signals was picked up by the RMS Carpathia, a passenger ship about 58 mil 93 kilometer away. The Carpathia Captain Arthur Rostron immediately ordered his crew to change course and head toward the Titanic. The Carpathia could travel at a maximum speed of 17 knots, but even at full speed, it would take 4 hours to reach the Titanic. Meanwhile, other ships like the Californian were closer but did not respond in time. The Californian wireless operator had gone to bed and didn't answer the distress calls as the crew lowered the lifeboats. Confusion and fear spread among the passengers. Most people didn't understand how serious the situation was. The Titanic was still brightly lit and the band continued to play cheerful music to keep everyone calm. In first class, some passengers hesitated to leave their luxurious surroundings. They thought the lifeboats were just a precaution, and third class passengers faced a much harder time. Many were trapped in the lower decks and struggled to find their way to the lifeboats. Language barriers made it even worse, as many third class passengers were immigrants who didn't speak English. By 12:30 a.m., the first lifeboat was lowered into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. It had space for 65 people, but only 28 passengers were on board. This was a common pattern throughout the night. Many lifeboats left the Titanic half empty because passengers didn't believe the ship was sinking, or thought they'd be safer staying on board as water continued to pour into the Titanic. It became clear that the ship's watertight compartments were not enough to save it. These apartments were designed to keep water contained, but they only extended partway up the ship. Once the water reached the top of these compartments, it began spilling over into the next ones. By 1:30 a.m., the bow front of the Titanic was fully underwater. The ship began to tilt forward, and panic spread among the passengers as the lifeboats filled and were lowered. The passengers faced another deadly threat: the icy water. The temperature of the North Atlantic that night was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. Most passengers and crew who entered the water without a lifeboat did not survive. The Titanic had 2,224 people on board, but only 705 survived, most of them in lifeboats. At around 2:15 a.m., the Titanic situation reached its breaking point. Literally, the weight of the water flooding the ship caused immense pressure, and the Titanic began to crack. Here's how it happened. The bow was already underwater. Pulling the ship downward, the stern back of the ship was lifted high into the air. The stress on the middle section of the ship was too much, and the Titanic broke into two pieces. The two halves of the ship sank separately. The bow plunged to the ocean floor first. The stern floated for a few moments before also sinking at 4 a.m. 2 hours after the Titanic sank. The RMS Carpathia finally arrived. The crew immediately began rescuing survivors from the lifeboats. The Carpathia crew worked tirelessly to pull people from the freezing water. Many survivors were in shock, crying or suffering from hypothermia. Some were too weak to climb aboard and had to be lifted with ropes. By 8:30 a.m., all survivors had been rescued, and the Carpathia set course for New York. The survivors left behind the wreckage of the Titanic and the bodies of more than 1,500 people who had perished after the Titanic tragedy. The world wanted answers. Could such a grand and unsinkable ship sink? Why did so many lives get lost? Ace investigations began. One shocking controversy came to light: the mysterious role of another ship. The SS Californian, which was just 37 kilometers 20 away from the Titanic when it sank. The SS Californian, a British steamship, was Sailing in the North Atlantic on the night of April 14th, 1912, the same night, the Titanic struck the iceberg unlike the Titanic. The Californian wasn't rushing to make headlines. It had stopped for the night because of ice warnings and was surrounded by icebergs. Its engines were off. And it was stationary in the cold, quiet ocean at around 11 p.m. The crew of the Californians spotted a larger ship in the distance. This was the Titanic from their deck. They could see the lights of the enormous vessel. When the Titanic began sinking, its crew launched rockets into the sky. As a distress signal, these white flares were visible 4 miles and were meant to alert nearby ships that something was wrong. The crew of the Californians saw these flares, one of their officers. Second Officer Herbert Stone reported to his captain Stanley Lord that he had seen the rocket stone. Also noted that the large ship appeared to be stopped. However, Captain Lord dismissed the situation, assuming it was nothing serious. He believed the ship might be holding a party or celebration, which was not uncommon. For wealthy passengers, one of the most critical mistakes made by the Callion was turning off its radio wireless for the night. The wireless operator's IRL Evans had gone to bed 11:30 p.m. Shortly before the Titanic began sending distress signals. This decision proved catastrophic. If the Californian radio had been on, its crew would have heard the Titanic's SOS calls and could have responded immediately. The ship was close enough to reach the Titanic in time to rescue hundreds of passengers who later died in the freezing water. The question remains, could the Californian have truly saved lives? Lives distance, the Californian was 20 moe, a distance it could have covered in about 2 hours. While it might not have arrived before the Titanic sank, it could have rescued many people from the lifeboats and freezing water. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m., and the Californian could have reached the site by 2:30 or 300 a.m., far earlier than the RMS Carpathia, which arrived at 4 a.m. Even saving 100 or 200 more lives would have drastically reduced the scale of the tragedy. The controversy surrounding the Californian led to significant changes in maritime practices. 2 of 47 radio operators' ships were required to keep their wireless radios manned at all times to ensure no distress signals would herd clear signals. New guidelines were introduced for distress flares, making it clear that rockets in the night sky always meant danger, not celebrations. Responsibility to investigate ships were instructed. To investigate any unusual activity, such as flares or nearby vessels appearing. Stationary Captain Stanley Lord's reputation was permanently damaged by the inquiry. Lord spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, but the controversy followed him until his death in 1962. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of human ambition, luxury, and dreams. But in one tragic night, all of that was lost to the icy waters of the Atlantic. Event today, over a century later, the Titanic remains one of the most fascinating stories in history. After the Titan I sank on April 15th, 1912. It disappeared into the dark depths off the Atlantic Ocean for decades. Noon knew exactly where the ship rested. People could only imagine what it looked like under the sea. Many believe the wreck would never be found, as it sank to a depth of 12,500 feet, 3,800 m, far beyond the reach of most explorers at the time. It wasn't until 1985, 73 years later, that the Titanic was finally discovered. Dr. Robert Ballard, a deep-sea explorer, and his team used advanced technology to find the shipwreck. They sent a robotic submarine to explore the ocean floor, and what they found was breathtaking. The bow front of the ship was relatively intact, while the stern back was twisted and broken, evidence of the ship splitting in two before its anchor around the wreck. There were shoes, dishes, luggage, and other personal belongings of the passengers. A haunting reminder of the lives lost. Since its discovery, scientists have studied the wreck and found that it's slowly being destroyed. Bacteria and salt water are eating away at the metal. According to experts, the Nick could completely disintegrate by 2030, leaving nothing but memories. Despite this, the fascination with the Titanic continues. It's not just about the ship itself, but what it represents: the ambition to build something extraordinary, the tragedy of overconfidence, the human stories of survival, loss, and courage. In 2012, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Titanic's inking, Australian billionaire Clive Palmer announced an ambitious plan to build a modern replica of the Titanic called Titanic 2. Titanic 2 would have the same luxurious design as the original, including grand staircases, elegant dining rooms, and vintage cabins. However, it would include modern safety features, such as more lifeboats and advanced navigation systems, to ensure history wouldn't repeat itself. The ship was planned to sail on the same route as the Titanic from Southampton to New York. While the project generated a lot of excitement, Myth has faced delays and challenges to this day. Titanic 2 has not been completed, but the idea shows how deeply the Titanic's legacy lives on in people's hearts. 70. 5 people survived, most of whom were women and children. Over 1,000 men perished as they gave up their spots on lifeboats for others. The Titanic taught the world many lessons. Sun overconfidence can be dangerous. People believed the Titanic was unsinkable. This overconfidence and mistakes, such as not having enough lifeboats and ignoring ice warnings. To respect nature, the iceberg was a reminder that nature is powerful and unpredictable event. Most advanced human creations can be humbled by the forces of nature. Third plan for the woe. Worse, the Titanic disaster changed safety regulations forever. Ships are now required to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radios must be manned 24/7 and safety drills are mandatory. The Titanic story is a mix of glamour, tragedy, and mystery. People are drawn to it because it feels like a cautionary